Hi everyone. In this lecture, I'll be going over the self and self-concept in early childhood. Okay, so your self-concept is a mental representation of who you are as a person. It can be understood as your individual perception of your behavior, skills, and unique characteristics. In early childhood, when identity is still developing, self-concept is malleable because young children are still figuring out who they are, who they want to be, and what is important to them. Frankly, many adults still do this. William James has described two elements of the self, I and me. So self as I. The I is the self who is aware, the self that feels, knows, and plans one's actions. It includes a sense of agency of initiation of behaviors and can be thought of as free will. It also includes a sense of uniqueness, what makes me different from you. It also includes a sense of continuity from one moment to the next and from one day to the next, meaning I don't change from today to tomorrow in significant ways. I don't become a completely different person. And finally, it includes an awareness of one's own awareness, which can be thought of as, which is called metacognition, thinking about thinking. Now, knowing who I am requires a sense of subjective awareness of where you end and where another person begins. In order to do this, the child needs to understand the world outside of them, themselves, and the interactions between the two. The self-concept also requires knowledge of others' perceptions of oneself. This me element is the self as an object, the pieces of the self that you can describe and that are observed by others. It includes physical characteristics like tall, long hair, etc., personality traits like being nice or generous, social roles and relationships such as being a daughter, a son, a wife, thoughts like I like cheese, and feelings like I feel happy. This component can include things like I am good at math or I am a trustworthy friend. Damon and Hart offer additional dimensions of this me development, which are fairly self-explanatory and encompass some of these different categories. So the physical self, physical, the social self, and the psychological self. Your text does a nice job of breaking down the components of the self-concept into 4 interacting and evolving pieces and discussing the different parts of the brain that appear to be responsible for each. Recognition and experiences of the physical self is one piece, and this includes awareness of one's own body, the sounds of one's voice, memories of past experiences, emotions tied to those experiences, tastes and preferences, and so on. Self-representations, which include use of personal pronouns, him, her, their, experiences of ownership, what belongs to you, awareness of personality traits and preferences, and self-appraisal, which is also known as self-esteem. It also includes awareness of the expectations of others for oneself and judging how you measure up to those expectations. So that could include something like what I expect of you as a student, and then how you feel you're doing as a student. And then finally, awareness of the factors that differentiate oneself from others. So how does it develop? Just as everything we've discussed so far, it develops over time. And it's the result of multiple interacting domains of development. Development of the self also happens over time and is the product of cognitive development, moral development, and identity development. In infancy, there's a gradual introduction and awareness of where the self ends and where others in the world begins. We can see this in the infant's efforts to interact with their environment. For example, touching the caregiver's face, grasping for objects, desires for closeness with the caregiver, and so on. This might not sound like a big deal, but remember that the first part of an infant's life was spent in complete connection to their mother. A few key terms to think about in infancy as they relate to the self include self-efficacy, which builds when the infant experiences success in exerting control over their environment or the caregiver. Self-worth, which builds from trust in others, worthiness and attachment, and the secure base. Remember what we learned about in the strange situation test. And then social referencing, which starts to facilitate recognition of the separateness of the other emotionally and cognitively. In toddlerhood, experiences, self-directed goal attainment, and social interactions continue to help the child differentiate themselves from others and the world. Beginning to understand agency also occurs in toddlerhood, and this involves knowing that they can have an effect on others and the world. At this point, toddlers are still very egocentric, so they haven't quite realized that others have their own emotions, perceptions, and experiences. And we can see this played out in the 3 mountains test, which I've linked for you on Canvas. In early school age, children begin to distinguish between the real self, meaning how they actually are, and the ideal self, meaning how they would like to be. Significant degrees of incongruence between the two can be associated with low self-esteem and the development of mental health problems. They also begin to differentiate between their capacities in different areas. So they may be really good at math, but really bad at art, for example. What they struggle with, though, is being able to form an integrated view of themselves that combines all of their strengths and weaknesses in all those different areas. In middle childhood, self-understanding relies much more heavily on social comparison. This is where children start to experience self-consciousness. Further, their egocentrism begins to reduce slightly, making it so that they can understand that others have their own perspectives. This is important because it also allows them to consider how various others view them, which then influences their own self-concept and self-esteem. Your text develops this information further, but since self-esteem is very likely something you'll help future clients with, I want to introduce you briefly to some important some important influences on self-esteem. First, messages of love, support, and approval from others are especially important for self-esteem and will help the individual to start to internalize some of those positive messages. Also, specific attributes and competencies matter for self-esteem. So the things that you're good at, for example, are going to bolster your self-esteem. Social comparison continues to matter extensively. The way that you evaluate yourself in comparison to others and to your ideal self. And then information that influences each of these is going to be gathered through daily experiences, successes, failures, interactions with others, and exposure to messages about what is worthy and valued in the world. All right, so that is it on moral development. On moral development. I'm thinking about the other lecture on self-esteem and self-concept. So kind of a complex thing to think about, but it makes sense, right? We're complex people. So we can talk more about this in class, but let me know if you have questions. Thanks for listening.